Hello and welcome to Senior Solutions, where we bring you topics affecting seniors and their loved ones. I'm your host, Mindy Felinton. Some of you may have thought about, well, if a loved one dies, what am I going to do? And some of you have actually pre-planned. And for those of you who haven't, my guest today is Jamie Arthurs, and he's the funeral pre-planning director, who's here to share with us some tidbits and information that you might find helpful and why it is important to pre-plan. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you, Mindy. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And let's talk about initially, why do you recommend that people pre-plan their funeral, whether it's a burial, cremation, and then we'll talk later on about the differences in the planning process for each of those.
Sure. Great question. We plan for every aspect of our life. We plan to go on vacation. We plan for retirement. We plan to send our kids to college. We plan for every aspect of our lives. But for some other reason, within our country, planning for this final life event is very difficult for people to understand or even talk about. It is a cycle of life event. We like to have them be celebrations if possible. And it's advisable because when people plan out ahead of time, not only are their wishes known, they financially are more frugal with their funds. They're not emotionally overspending.
Right, because I think that that's one of the things that comes to my mind, is that when people are caught up in that event and the emotions around it, then they are probably more likely to go way overboard on the best of everything, and it's a decision that they're making from an emotional side versus what you're suggesting.
You would never go and do a large purchase of any kind emotional. And on one of the possible worst days of an individual's life, you don't really want to be in a funeral home trying to plan out an event that could be as sizable as a wedding for a lot of funerals, and have that event be rushed. So why not take some time, sit down with someone like myself, and go through the events, go through all the options that are there, and plan out the event ahead of time so your survivors, your spouse, your children don't have that additional stress during an extremely stressful time.
Right.
The funeral business does get a bad rap sometimes about quote unquote taking advantage of people because funerals are high cost items. But if you were able to come in and pre-plan, and one of the benefits behind pre-planning is you're able to guarantee and lock in that funeral cost, whatever that might be. So it's inflation proof. So if you pre-plan now and the death occurs in 20 years, you don't have that 20 years worth of inflation worked into it. So there's a lot of advantages to it.
When do you recommend that people start looking at doing this pre-planning?
I would probably recommend around retirement, when people are looking at their retirement portfolio, what they're going to be living on, maybe when they start to downsize from that, single-family home to a condo or a senior living community. That's a good time to start looking at that option. And then looking at it, too, and having that conversation with your spouse, it's really surprising the amount of couples I've sat down with who have been married 30, 40, 50 years who've never had that conversation on how they want their life to be remembered, how they want their life to be celebrated. Whether it's something very simple or something very extravagant, it's going to be up to that person. And we're here to help, do that life event for them. It's just surprising to me.
Well, in what I do, I'm amazed at how many people don't have a will.
Yes, same purpose, same purpose.
Right. People think that they're going to do that, and then they're going to die. They may think the same thing with you. If they come in, they plan, then they're going to die right away.
I've had families say that to me, like, I don't want to do this because I don't, it's that weird social stigma, I think, that comes with it. It's difficult. It's a difficult conversation to have now, but it's so much more difficult when you're emotional and your loved one's passed and your spouse is passed and you're thinking about and trying to remember the good times and comfort your kids, or your kids are comforting you, but yet you have to go to a funeral home to plan out this event and all of a sudden come up with the funds to have to pay for it too.
which can be steep, and we'll get
Yes.
into that too. Tell me, what are some of the things that are included in what you look at when you are pre-planning? From flowers to grave, can you
I
talk a
look at
little
all
bit more?
aspects. So I'm going to look at, what kind of service a person wants, whether they want to do burial or cremation. Some families want us to help out with body donation, which we can do a little bit, but not a lot.
What can you do in that regard?
I can help direct people to the State Anatomy Board in Maryland. You can pre-authorize to have your body donated to them. Most learning hospitals want to have the pre-authorization done. It's very difficult to donate a deceased after the death has occurred. So you want to be able to have, especially if you're planning to donate your body, to have that done ahead of time. And the State Anatomy Board in Maryland is a good option to look at for that. As
Do
far
they
as
ever not want to take somebody?
there's conditions, recently in the last year or so, they come up with 5 or 6 different conditions that unfortunately I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
Certain different kinds of diseases or causes of death that they will not take the person. So you do have to have a fallback, maybe with the funeral home. Maybe not have something prepaid, but have a fallback done, have plans laid out so in case it is a vehicular death and they cannot take the deceased because of the death circumstances, you have something else in place.
A contingency plan.
Yes, contingency plan.
Right.
As far as what I do, I take the families through the whole from point A to point Z with it. So we're going to talk about burial or cremation options. We're going to talk about if they want a visitation, if they're a Christian or Catholic, if they want to have something like a very simple service, wood or metal caskets, how they want their life to be remembered.
When you say simple service, can you elaborate a little bit more about what would be a simple service versus a more elaborate?
Simple is such a broad definition for a lot of people. I usually try to sit down and have conversations like this with families in their home over coffee or tea and have them explain to me what simple is for them. I've had families go, simple is a graveside service at the cemetery, a very simple, maybe a plain pine casket or a simple metal casket, a few nice words said, clergy, and a very simple service, and then the family will have more of a celebration back at their home. I've had other people go simple and have 700 people turn up at a funeral for simple, and they have a very higher-end casket, and there's limousines. So it's going to vary a lot.
Right. It's more subjective.
Subjective to what they want. What we try to do is honor and dignify that person's life. So if, example, I had a woman call me today, her husband unfortunately is passing, and big Johnny Cash fan, and loved baseball. So I was talking with her, I was like, okay, so for the visitation you want to have for your husband, maybe have everyone come in their favorite baseball gear, baseball hats and jerseys. We'll make a nice mix of Johnny Cash that's appropriate for public. And have that played during the visitation. You can bring in a lot of photos. We'll make a DVD presentation about his life. If I believe she said he played, maybe have his glove and his bat there, and try to honor his life and make it meaningful for them.
Very nice. What would you? And I know I'm going off
totally
subject, but hopefully I'll bring you back.
You will.
Tell me about one of the most exotic or unusual types of funerals, or give us some examples. I would imagine there's got to be something a bit
There's a lot of different
interesting
variations. People can be buried at sea, and that's a difference. You can be cremated and have your cremains scattered at sea.
Well, in your experience, have you, like, for example,
I've never done a burial at sea. I've buried a lot of people on their private family land.
Oh, really?
And here in Montgomery County, there's some legal hoops you have to go through for that to get a cemetery established on your private land. We've done larger services, in excess of 1,000 people, to where the person was just so loved by the community that they lived in, a larger turnout, happens. Had a family once, they were cremating, the wife came in with her brother-in-laws, her husband was passing, had a rare form of cancer, was only 50, and he was a big fly fisherman. Every spring he would go on a fly fishing trip with his friends. I was like, ma'am, why don't you I was like, you said he was a fly fisherman. She goes, yes. I was like, because he's being cremated, and you're going to have the urn present at the memorial service, you don't need to, per se, have pallbearers to carry the urn. For the urn, I was able to give her the idea of using one of his wicker tackle boxes for the urn because that would be very symbolic for them.
Right.
And that worked out well.
Great idea.
His friends, who were his fishing buddies, at the end of the service, they came out, put their waders on, had their fly fishing poles, and formed like an archway outside the chapel doors for everyone to walk through, because fly fishing for them and that family was such a big thing for them. Even as simple as, ma'am, you said that your father, when he was living, always got your mom red roses for Valentine's Day. Why don't we have a display of red roses and maybe put, and how long were they married? 50. Why don't we put 50 red roses in the casket with her? Something like that.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So it gets really quite creative.
And that's part of the pre-planning process, is the fact you have the time to sit down with someone and pull out those tidbits that they were a fly fisherman, they loved the Yankees, whatever it might be, because when you're rushing to plan an event over 2 days, you're not able to really pull out those details and remember that. Dad mentioned one time to me that you want to have "I Did It My Way" played at his funeral by Frank Sinatra. But, that's something that gets misplaced. We had the manager that I work with. He was very quick on his feet, and the daughter mentioned that during her eulogy at the funeral, that Dad's favorite song was "I Did It My Way" by Frank Sinatra. So we were able to hop on iTunes, download it, put it in the CD player. So when we brought the casket out of the chapel, we played that for the family, and they loved it. So when you're sitting and you're looking at a funeral home, you want to find something that's within your means, and people that are going to have that attention to detail that you want for a once-in-a-lifetime event. You can redo a wedding, you can redo a birthday party, you can't redo a funeral.
Yeah. Never thought of it that way, but yes.
So
we're going to get ready to take a
Okay.
break. But what I'd like to do when we come back from the break is to talk about what are those things that people should look at and consider when selecting a funeral home to work with. So I think that might be a good place for us to stop.
That'll be
then
good.
When we come back from our break, we will proceed to talk about that.
Sounds great. Thank you, Mindy.
And we will be right back.
For those dealing with the daily struggles of caring for a loved one, we hear you. That's why AARP created a community with experts and other caregivers to help us better care for ourselves and the ones we love.
Hello and welcome back to Senior Solutions, where we bring you topics affecting seniors and their loved ones. And I'm your host, Mindy Felinton, and I'm joined today by Jamie Arthurs, who is a pre-planning funeral advisor. And we left for a break where we were going to talk about how to decide or what things you should look for when choosing a funeral home.
A lot of families, when I speak to them, because I represent different funeral homes in the D.C. metropolitan area, you want to find a funeral home that's within your means, whatever that might be, and that's going to be suitable for you. Funeral homes are a service-based industry. Though we sell caskets and we sell urns, we do a lot of different things for families. We have a lot of different personalization products to help them remember their loved one. You want to make sure that A, it was within your means, because it is a larger purchase, and that you're planning for that. So oftentimes I'll compare the funeral industry to the hotel industry. If you think about like the Marriott or Hilton hotel chains, they have different levels of service per different hotel you can stay at. They have the Hampton Inn, which is a great hotel, very nice, but you also have very higher ends like a Waldorf Astoria or JW Marriott that are extremely high-end, and that comes with that level of service. Funeral industry is the same way. Especially here in Washington, D.C., there are funeral homes that are very simplistic. They do all the basic services that any other funeral home does at a lower cost. There's other funeral homes that come with a very higher end of service and the cost comes along with that.
Yes.
So
So it's a function of really the cost.
It's the cost, the service level that the family's looking for, and then maybe they're expecting. A lot of funeral homes here in the D.C. area, it's also about the uniqueness you can bring to the service.
Like you were saying before we went to our break about taking the time to listen with the My Way iTunes download.
Yes. It's picking up on the little tidbits and information you get from the individual families. Funerals should never be cookie cutter. What is good for this family here is not going to be good for this family over here. And the industry, I think, has, for the longest time, did a disservice to itself, because instead of us advising and guiding the family, the funeral industry was more in control of the event. And in the last 5 to 7 years, the funeral industry has kind of taken that stance again of, we're here to advise and help the family through this really hard time in their lives, but we're not in control of that event. That family is in control of that event to honor their loved one, and we're here to make sure they can do that properly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So.
Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking about what would mine be. Mine would definitely have to be dog focused.
We can do that.
It's all about dogs.
I've had families, and I'll make that suggestion a lot. If I don't really go per se out on transfers anymore. When a deceased person passes, I'm more of the planning stage with families ahead of time. But one of the things I used to do, if I would see a dog in the home, is go, ma'am, I know that you have a dog in the home. I was like, do you want to bring the dog into the funeral home to spend some time with your husband? We can do that? 100%, yes, ma'am. We'll schedule a time, make sure that there's other families there by chance that may not have issues with dogs. So you can bring the person in, the dog can spend time. The dog is part of the family. You want to make sure that part of their life is honored too. So whatever that might be, we can definitely make happen.
So I'm not the only crazy person.
No. We've done dogs. I've done 2 people have brought in cats. No other animals besides dog and cats, though, I can think of.
Yeah. No exotic snakes or something?
No exotic snakes.
Okay.
No.
One of the things that I think that for me is confusing, and when I'm working with my clients to kind of get through these processes as well, is the confusion of what's included in the burial plan versus the funeral component. Can you just kind of distinguish those 2 aspects and how you're involved in both of those?
Yeah. So the funeral home's there to coordinate everything around this event for the family. So whether it's limousine, flowers, catering, guest book, thank you notes, clergy, church service, we can do all that. We'll also coordinate with the cemetery. Now the difference between what the cemetery does and the funeral home is this. The funeral home is going to provide all those services to the family. Limousine, flowers, catering, casket selection if they buy the casket at the funeral home, all the visitation, physical transfer of their loved one, and all the preparation services. And then we're going to organize everything and take their loved one to whatever that cemetery is. The cemetery ahead of that time would have taken care of the plot. Typically there's an outer enclosure that goes around the casket that's required here in the D.C. metropolitan area. Per se required, it's a requirement by a lot of cemeteries in the D.C. area, not a state law locally. Okay. And they're going to take care of the headstone or the marker, and then there's an opening, what they call an opening and closing fee, which is the physical digging of the grave. So there's 5 things that the cemetery that's going to do.
Okay.
The actual purchase of the land, the burial vault or outer enclosure, the physical digging of the grave, the headstone or marker. There's usually a processing fee they charge.
Okay.
So those are those 5. Everything else is done by the funeral home.
Okay. Well, that was really helpful because I get confused on who's doing what.
Yeah.
So that's good to know. And then with the cremation, I would imagine there are different laws and there are a lot of requirements. Do you want to talk about what those requirements are and how cremation is very different when you're planning for that?
Cremation is different in a couple different ways. You don't have to have a cemetery for cremation. Once you do the cremation, a person can scatter their loved one in a proper place. They can keep their loved one in.
What is a proper place?
Proper place, legally you cannot scatter in any public parks. If you're illegally going to scatter, they say down at the beach, you need to be 3 miles out to legally scatter. We can help arrange that for a family. A lot of families that maybe have some private land or will go up into the mountains and scatter, have families do that. I've had families scatter in public areas, just not tell us.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, who really knows? But
you don't know.
But I didn't say that.
I always advise families, when they go to scatter their loved one, wherever that is, to make sure they have a copy of the cremation certificate with them, which is going to be given to them by the crematory through the funeral home, stating that on X date, John Smith was cremated by this crematory. I have a copy of the death certificate with them. So God forbid they are stopped by someone of law authority, they know what they have. So cremation law actually varies between D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. In Maryland, legally, you can have 2/3 of the family authorize their cremation. So if mom has already passed, dad just passed, and there's 3 children, legally 2/3, so 2 of those kids can authorize their cremation. Most funeral homes in the D.C. area want to try to get all 3 of those surviving children, just so there's no issues down the line.
And what if they don't agree?
If they don't agree, we'll do our due diligence to make sure we get some sort of documentation that we've done our best to make sure, though Jamie didn't want dad to be cremated, he knows about it and there's no issue down the line for either the funeral home or the family. It's hard enough to lose someone, and then to have a lawsuit come off of that in some way, shape, or form is even such more of a headache. So in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, for cremation, you have to be legally identified and visually identified at the funeral home in the container you're going to be cremated in. So that means when you go to the funeral home, part of that process of finalizing those arrangements is spending time with your loved one to say, yes, this is that person. And there's different documentation that's signed off on between a visual identification, the cremation authorization, that it's going to give us that legal authority, and we have to have that signed death certificate. Now, if the death occurs in D.C. proper, the D.C. medical examiner charges the family a $75 permit fee to approve the death certificate for cremation. So that can hold up our process for about a week sometimes.
Why is it that there are just so much more restrictive rules and laws relative to cremation?
Because it's an irreversible process. We can't undo it. And that's the biggest hurdle we have is you want to make sure that that same person, the person you're getting back from the crematory. Funny story, I have this. Back in 2006 when we had the big blizzard, I was working for a transfer company in Baltimore. I was helping out doing transfers from point A to point B of a deceased. And my manager and I went to a residence, and the wife had taken a Sharpie marker and written the gentleman's name on his legs, his arms, his back, his chest, because she heard stories and looked at things on the internet of how the wrong people being cremated. Most funeral homes have such a stringent, and the funeral homes I represent have such a stringent process in place of identification the entire time the person's in our care. From when we leave the hospital, making sure that ID band the hospital has on it, and the ID band we legally put on them on their left long bone on their left leg, that's going to have their name, their date of birth, their date of death, and their funeral home location on it, is with them that entire time. Because that's what we're using for ID purposes. And then when the family IDs that person at the funeral home, they authorize and sign off on that. And the family can even go to the crematory to witness the cremation if they choose to. They don't stay for the entire process. The entire cremation process is about 4 or 5 hours.
Oh, wow.
So the family can go and witness their loved one being placed in the machine called a retort.
Yeah, I have done that.
Okay.
A friend of mine,
wow,
whose husband was cremated. I went to the place in Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of Buddhist families will do that.
Yes.
A lot of families who just want to go through the entire process will do that. A demonized closure, like when you see the casket lowered at the cemetery, you know that's that final time. Mm-hmm. So it sort of depends on what the families want to do when it comes to the witnessing the cremation. But you want to also make sure that the funeral home you're using owns their own crematory. They're not going to give it out to a third-party company. So they may not have a crematory on the grounds at the funeral home, but they're using a company-owned crematory, and that crematory only does cremations for human beings, not for other species.
Ah. So many nuances.
A lot of nuances, yes.
So the woman who marked her husband off,
Yes.
she was
She was just scared because of stuff she saw online, as a lot of people get. They'll see things online or hear things in the news and Google something and find out a lot of misinformation. Never per se believe what you're going to read online about a funeral home, or you want to go to that location, you want to talk to those people and make sure it's that fit for your family.
Tell me about veterans.
Veterans, yes.
Because we do in this area have a lot of veterans.
Yes.
And how, I know there's confusion, I hear it again with clients I'm working with, about where they can be buried and how that works.
Yes. So with the VA will give up to a $2,000 funeral benefit and up to, I believe, a $700 cemetery benefit after the death has occurred. So that family has to apply for those benefits. Now, if their loved one's buried in a veteran cemetery, Quantico, Arlington National, Cheltenham, other ones in the area, they cannot get that $700 cemetery benefit, but they can still apply for that $2,000 funeral benefit. But the VA does it on a per-case basis. Just because you apply for it does mean you're going to get it. Mm-hmm. So locally, the biggest hurdle we have, granted, is with the Arlington National Cemetery. Gorgeous cemetery, great people who work there. Because of such a large influx that they have, you're looking for a burial of your loved one at Arlington anywhere from the low end for a month for a spouse who didn't serve, up to 6 months for a burial for someone who's eligible for full honors at Arlington.
Wow.
So funeral homes locally have to hold that person. That person most likely will probably be embalmed and then kept in refrigeration. Some funeral homes locally will charge a holding fee for that longer period. The funeral homes I represent don't. We don't see the need for that. It's not the family's fault that Arlington has such a long wait. Arlington has such a large influx that they deal with on a daily basis. They want to make sure that the person is eligible for burial there. So it's just part of what we deal with locally.
It's horrible that they have to wait all that time.
It is. It is. A lot of families, when they have a burial at Arlington, they'll do a memorial service around the time of the death within a week, typically, and then we'll hold that person at the funeral home until that service at Arlington. Because the procedure currently with Arlington is we'll give them a phone call, they'll put us into a queue and give us a reference number, and they call us back in about 3 or 4 weeks with a potential date a month or more down the line.
Got it.
So we never know.
Okay. Jamie,
Yes.
I really appreciate your being here, and I know there's so much more to cover. But
Yes, there is.
If somebody wanted to get in touch with you and talk about pre-planning, how would they do that?
They can contact me directly on my cell phone, 240-463-6884. I do free in-home consultations and provide the family with a copy of our personal planning guide, which is a blueprint to plan out your funeral and your end-of-life wishes. They also can reach me via email, which is jamie.arthurs@dignitymemorial.com.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mindy.
And if you have an idea for a topic you'd like to see on Senior Solutions, please feel free to contact me at seniorsolutionsTV@gmail.com. And we'll see you next time.